Welcome to the Deep Dive, everybody. Ready to explore something new today?
Always.
Today, we're diving into the world of transborder broadcasting, basically using radio to reach audiences beyond a country's borders.
Ah, fascinating.
Our main source is this academic text called Transborder Broadcasting,
Okay.
and it really digs deep into how radio is used for all sorts of things like warfare and propaganda, even public diplomacy.
Wow.
It's wild, from building empires to waging ideological wars, all through radio waves, right?
Radio waves. It's amazing, how radio, almost from the very beginning, was used to connect with people far, far beyond a nation's borders.
Yeah.
Governments and organizations. They quickly saw its potential to influence not just individuals, but entire populations.
Absolutely. So let's start with the early days.
Okay.
Think the 1920s.
Right.
The text mentions several countries that were already experimenting with this new technology, like the Soviet Union,
Uh-huh.
the Netherlands, France, the UK, Portugal.
Makes sense. They were all pretty ahead of the curve, I guess.
Yeah, and they all had different goals in mind.
Oh, I bet.
For the Soviets, Radio Moscow became like their platform to spread communist ideology globally.
Right.
They were really pioneers in international broadcasting.
Yeah.
They used radio to really shape global perceptions of communism. It wasn't just about transmitting the news, but about crafting a narrative,
Absolutely.
promoting their political system, influencing global opinion.
Yeah.
Then you have European empires, particularly the UK and the Netherlands, using shortwave radio to connect with their colonies and their citizens living abroad.
Right, because shortwave, unlike typical AM radio, could transmit signals across vast distances, right?
Huge distances, yeah, perfect for reaching far-flung corners of their empires.
I mean, think about the impact of hearing familiar voices, music from your homeland, when you're thousands of miles away,
Oh, yeah.
living in like a remote colonial outpost.
Yeah,
It would have been so powerful, to maintain that psychological connection.
sure.
Bridge the distance, reinforce the idea of the empire.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the text even mentions this Dutch program called Microphone Debutantes,
What's that?
where children in the Netherlands would read letters to their parents living in the East Indies, which is modern-day Indonesia.
Oh, wow.
That must have resonated so deeply with families separated by, such vast distances.
Oh, absolutely. It wasn't just about information, but like emotion,
Yeah.
shared experience. You can imagine families huddled around a radio, listening to their children's voices,
Right.
feeling that sense of connection and belonging.
Even across continents.
Right. It was powerful. Empires could maintain influence, shape the cultural landscape of their colonies.
Right. But as you mentioned earlier, radio's potential for influence went way beyond just connecting people.
Oh, for sure.
It quickly became apparent that it could be used to shape opinions and even spread propaganda, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The text actually points to Italy and Germany under fascist rule as examples of countries that really utilized radio to promote their agendas.
Right.
In the years leading up to World War II, radio became a battleground for hearts and minds,
Yeah,
and the stakes just got higher and higher as war approached.
absolutely. And the text highlights the Spanish Civil War, which took place just before World War II, as kind of a turning point.
Interesting.
It was a conflict where both sides, they used radio to sway public opinion, even influence troops.
So they saw the potential there, huh?
Yeah, the Spanish Civil War really offered a glimpse of how radio could be weaponized during a conflict. It went beyond simply reporting the events. It became a tool for shaping perceptions, disseminating propaganda,
Yeah.
and ultimately, trying to influence the course of the war itself.
Shaping the narrative.
Exactly. And then when World War II broke out, the scale, the sophistication of radio warfare just exploded.
I bet.
The text focuses quite a bit on Nazi Germany's efforts, and they went all in.
I mean, they were known for their propaganda machine.
They were. They understood the power of radio to demoralize enemies, to influence neutral countries. They poured resources into building this vast network of radio stations, broadcasting in multiple languages,
Wow.
targeting specific audiences with very carefully crafted messages.
Strategic.
Very, yeah. And they weren't afraid to get creative either. They used what they called black broadcasting, creating these fake radio stations that sounded like they were coming from enemy territory.
Ooh, sneaky.
Very sneaky. One example from the text is the new British Broadcasting Station, which was actually operated by the Germans.
Wow, so like a wolf in sheep's clothing kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. The goal of black broadcasting was to sow confusion, undermine trust in official sources.
Right.
And by mimicking the style and format of legitimate broadcasts, they could subtly inject their propaganda into enemy territory.
I see. Create doubt.
Yeah, maybe even sway public opinion. One of the most famous examples of this was Lord Haw Haw, the voice of the NBBS. His real name was William Joyce. And he was an American, believe it or not, who became a really fervent supporter of Nazi ideology.
Wow, so he switched sides.
Yeah, and his broadcasts were this blend of news, commentary, music, propaganda, all delivered in this distinctive, almost hypnotic tone.
Interesting. So they were using like entertainment to draw people in.
Yeah, very much so. And he was a master at playing on people's fears and anxieties, particularly in Britain.
Right, at a very uncertain time. Makes sense.
Yeah. And on the other side of the world, you had Japan, using a similar tactic to target Allied troops in the Pacific.
Okay.
Tokyo Rose, like Lord Haha, wasn't just a single person, but rather this collective of female announcers who broadcasted in English,
Uh-huh.
often using American slang and popular music.
Interesting.
These broadcasts, often laced with propaganda and misinformation, aimed to demoralize American soldiers, sow doubt,
Yeah.
and ultimately, undermine their fighting spirit. It's a powerful example of how radio could be used to target specific groups
Right.
with very tailored messages. But amidst all this propaganda and misinformation, there were also these voices of truth and resistance.
Okay, good.
The text highlights the BBC's role during World War II. Even with wartime restrictions, they really remained committed to accurate reporting.
They had a reputation for that.
Yeah, they did. And the BBC's reputation for reliable news was crucial in combating all of the misinformation that was being spread by the Axis powers.
Right, right.
They also played a vital role in supporting resistance movements
Oh, how so?
by broadcasting messages of hope and encouragement into occupied territories.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. The text actually mentions this incredible story of Anne Frank, who found inspiration and hope listening to a Dutch official broadcasting from London during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands.
Wow, that's amazing.
It's a powerful reminder of the impact these broadcasts could have on individual lives. It wasn't just about receiving information. It was about finding a connection, a sense of hope, a reminder that they weren't alone. Radio provided this lifeline for people living under oppression,
Right.
a glimmer of light during some of the darkest moments of the war.
Yeah.
The United States, though, was initially a latecomer to this radio war. But eventually, they ramped up their efforts with the Voice of America, or VOA,
Okay.
and the Armed Forces Network. They were determined to counter enemy propaganda and get their own message out to the world.
So the U.S. was playing catch-up.
They were. And the creation of VOA marked a pretty significant shift in U.S. foreign policy.
Interesting.
It reflected this growing awareness of the importance of international broadcasting
Yeah.
and the need to actively shape global narratives.
Shape the story that's being told.
Exactly. And that battle for the airwaves, that fight to control information and influence global opinion. It only intensified with the end of World War II and the beginning of course, the Cold War.
Right, because it was a whole new type of conflict.
Exactly. So we've gone from like battling empires to a full-blown world war, all played out on the radio waves.
It's crazy, right?
And then the Cold War.
Yeah.
The Cold War takes this whole fight for the airwaves to like a whole new level, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. I mean, the Cold War was this period of intense ideological struggle
Right.
between the United States and the Soviet Union and radio. Well, it became one of the key battlegrounds.
Yeah.
This war of words and ideas.
Narratives.
Yeah, all transmitted across borders.
Through the power of radio.
Exactly.
So Radio Moscow, which we talked about earlier,
Yeah.
had already established this broad reach during World War II,
Uh-huh.
continued to be a major player,
Of course.
broadcasting in dozens of languages, reaching audiences across the globe.
Right. Spreading their message.
Yeah, promoting their version of events.
Their ideology.
Yeah, their view of the world.
Exactly.
And the U.S. countered not just with existing stations like VOA, but also creating new ones,
Right.
like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty,
Right.
specifically to target audiences within the Soviet bloc.
Right. And other communist countries.
So what were they broadcasting? Was it just straight up anti-communist propaganda?
Well, I mean, the goal was definitely to challenge those regimes, but their approach, it was more nuanced than just, blatant propaganda. They
Oh.
focused heavily on providing news and information,
Okay.
stuff that was often suppressed in those countries.
Right, so almost like trying to counter the state-controlled narratives.
Exactly, by offering alternative perspectives, exposing the realities of life under communist rule.
So kind of offering a different viewpoint and letting listeners draw their own conclusions?
Right.
That's a fascinating approach, right?
It was. It was a subtle yet powerful approach. It
Right.
wasn't like they were telling people what to think. They were just giving them the information and letting them, form their own opinions.
Right.
And, in a lot of cases, that information, it was a revelation.
Yeah.
It offered this glimpse into a world that was vastly different from what their own governments were telling them.
Wow. The text mentions that Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty were initially presented as, like, tightly funded,
Uh-huh.
but were actually secretly backed by the CIA.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, kind of a classic Cold War tactic, right?
Yeah,
It allowed the U.S. government to maintain this degree of plausible deniability
sure.
while actively engaging in what was essentially a form of ideological warfare. They understood the power of these broadcasts, right,
Yeah,
to potentially influence public opinion, maybe even sow dissent within these communist countries.
right.
How did the Soviets react to this? Like, all these broadcasts coming from the West,
I mean, they were not happy.
were they seen as a genuine threat
Oh, yeah,
or just
absolutely.
like a nuisance?
No, a threat. They invested heavily in jamming those foreign broadcasts, trying to block the signals from reaching their citizens.
So they saw it as a real danger.
Oh, yeah. This jamming, it was a clear indication that they considered these stations to be a serious challenge
Wow.
to their control over information, to their ideological
It's like
dominance.
an electronic battle raging across the airwaves.
Right. It's wild to think about, right?
Yeah, countries trying to drown each other out, with competing signals, all in
Crazy.
the name of influencing, hearts and minds.
Hearts and minds. It was a really remarkable time, and it wasn't just Europe.
Right?
The Cold War was global, and this battle for the airwaves, it extended to other regions as well, like
Yeah.
East and Southeast Asia, where China emerged as a major player with Radio Beijing.
So this wasn't just a European phenomenon, but this truly global struggle,
Absolutely.
with radio at the center as a weapon in the fight for global influence, ideological dominance.
Precisely. And it's important to remember, this wasn't just about abstract ideas or political maneuvering. It had a real impact on people's lives.
Right.
Imagine living in a closed society, cut off from the outside world, and suddenly you're hearing these broadcasts
Yeah.
offering different perspectives, news from beyond your borders, glimpses of different ways of life.
Must have been pretty eye-opening for those who could tune in.
It was, and for some, it was even life-changing.
Wow.
It could inspire dissent, fuel hopes for a different future, or even just provide a sense of connection to the wider world.
Yeah. So the Cold War ultimately ends, but the use of transporter broadcasting, it didn't.
Nope, not at all.
It continues to this day, especially in regions where internet access is limited
Right.
or heavily censored.
Radio, it remains vital for reaching people,
Right.
parts of the world where other forms of media, they might be restricted. It's a testament to its resilience,
Yeah.
its ability to connect people across borders, even in the digital age.
Right. And speaking of the digital age, our source material mentions this fascinating example from the recent conflict in Ukraine.
Okay.
So the BBC had shut down its shortwave broadcasting to Eastern Europe years ago,
Right.
but they actually brought it back in 2022.
Wow.
Pretty crazy.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
It really does say a lot about the enduring power of shortwave radio, especially in times of crisis or conflict.
Right?
When internet access is disrupted or unreliable,
Yeah.
shortwave, it can still get through.
It can reach remote areas.
It's less susceptible to jamming. It remains vital, a link to the outside world for a lot of people.
It's so fascinating how this technology, invented over a century ago, right,
Yeah,
can still play such a crucial role in today's world.
absolutely. And you know what it highlights? That while technology may evolve, that fundamental human need, the need for information and connection, that remains constant.
Yeah, it's amazing, right? From connecting empires to Cold War battles on the airwaves, all the way to shortwave making a comeback today. It's been quite a journey. What stands out to you the most from all this?
What really gets me is this whole idea of the imagined audience, It's mentioned a lot in our source material.
Yeah.
Governments, they poured so much into transborder broadcasting, almost like they believed millions were just hanging on every word.
Right?
Even when, they couldn't really know for sure who was listening or what impact it all was having.
It's a really good point. It shows just how much of this was about perception, right?
Uh-huh.
The desire to, like, project influence.
Project Power, yeah.
Even when it was hard to measure if it was really working. Do you think that's still true today?
Oh, I think so.
Like, in the age of the internet and social media,
Yeah.
are governments still trying to, shape the global narrative through broadcasting, even if they can't be sure who's really listening?
I think so. I mean, the methods, they might have changed, but the goal is still the same,
Right.
to influence how people see things.
Yeah, to shape the global narrative.
Exactly. Think about how governments use social media.
Yeah, good point.
It's like a platform to get their message out there.
Right, to a global audience.
Yeah.
It's like a modern-day version of what we've been talking about, right?
Exactly.
Transborder broadcasting, just, on a different platform.
Right.
So much of what we've talked about today just really shows how information and technology and power are all connected.
Totally. I mean, transborder broadcasting, especially during like those big moments of the 20th century, it was a perfect example of how those forces, how they can be used,
Yeah.
to shape events, to sway opinions, even, change the course of history.
This deep dive, it's really been an eye-opener. It's made me think about, like, radio and now the internet. They're not just tools for communication.
No.
They're platforms where ideas get debated, narratives are built, and, power dynamics are at play.
Yeah, and I think that's super important for anyone listening, as we all try to navigate this world, which just keeps getting more complex and interconnected.
Right.
It's so important to be aware of the things that shape the information we get, the stories we hear, whether it's a radio broadcast or something you see on social media. We have to think critically
Yeah.
about the source, the message, who it's meant for.
That's a great point to wrap things up on. Next time you're listening to the radio or scrolling through your phone, stop and think. And
Yeah.
think about the bigger picture, the motivations behind it all, the impact it could have. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of transborder broadcasting.
It's been fun.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep.